Here's a potentially a very nice camera, Retina IIS, the little brother to the Retina 3S cameras. It doesn't have an interchangeable lens, it has a 45mm f2.8 Xenar lens. But apart from that, it's very similar to a 3S camera. So this one, what's its problem? Well, the shutter's the problem, or the main problem. Basically, it doesn't go. You can see right through there, the shutter's jammed open at the moment. If I play with it enough, I can probably get it to close, but it certainly doesn't function correctly. So, shutter certainly needs to be stripped and serviced, otherwise this is going nowhere. What other problems can we see here? Well, we've got an exposure meter which may or may not be reasonably accurate. The ASA dial on the top here, it's probably difficult to tell on the camera, but that is translucent rather than transparent. Someone's cleaned that with solvent and they've buggered up the plastic as a result. Most likely it's going to be easier to replace that than it is to try and polish that out. If I had no replacements, I'd polish it with some Perspex polish. It's a tedious process, but you can usually bring them back to transparent if you do that. Anything else of note? Not particularly. The camera appears to be in quite good condition. A few Zeiss bumps on the Leatherette there at the catch end. Otherwise the back is very good and smooth. The Leatherettes have to come off the front, of course, for servicing, I think. Yes, because I'll be stripping the front plate out of it. But apart from that, no, it's a tidy example. I expect this one, geez, I've said this a few times, I expect this one to go smoothly. Or at least I hope. So, to take the camera apart. Something through the fork of the rewind, spin the knob off. Easy. I'll sort the parts out into a pile to go through the ultrasonic cleaner, and parts that will not. And I'll take apart that rewind knob as soon as I find the appropriate tool. Fortunately everything is tidy at the moment, so it means everything's in a huge heap. Later everything will be spread over the bench top in the manner that I like. Right, 2 screws at the rewind end, chrome plated of course. There's no repair sticker in the back of this camera, so it may never have been serviced in its entire life for all I know. Lift the top cover off and you can see here exactly how bad that plastic disc is. Put the top cover to one side. Right, so the button can come off. And the spring under the button is very easily lost, being quite small. And you've got to be careful not to lose that. The shutter release button can come off. Let's start down here, take that strap lug off. It's a bit gooey. Bit of sand, I'm seeing a bit of sand down here, so it's been to the beach or the back of the camera. Yeah, have a look at all this sand in here. That's a nuisance. Well, it's not going to help it run. Get the rangefinder off. I don't think the sand is the problem with the shutter, that's much more likely just to be the usual problem with leaf blade shutters. It's simply everything is stuck with oil. The rewind shaft can come off. Some of these screws are a bit reluctant to come out. Okay, well, I'm going to just disconnect that meter, I think, because I'm going to be putting it back anyway, so I'm not at all concerned about the setting of that. I'll just unhook that and put my meter to one side. I can see that the video camera in its traditional way is waving its arms about and to let me know that the battery's very flat. Well, that's a surprise. The battery's always very flat. Off with that chrome trim, put that spring to one side, put the film release button there, shutter release shaft can come out. It's quite long on this camera, as you can see, much like a Retinette in that regard. The shutter cocking rack, we've got a screw here and the post, of course. Now, someone was commenting recently on the shutter cocking rack for Retina IIS, and yes, it is the same as for Retina 3C. The later 3Cs, it's got this slight bevel on this piece here, which allows that to come up, gives it more clearance up against the rangefinder. Okay, so far so good. Let's get the screw out of here. Now, it has occurred to me that people would perhaps prefer videos which concentrated on a single repair or a repair of a particular problem. But unfortunately, with these cameras being as old as they are, they don't have a particular problem. They have a whole fleet of them. And the only practical thing to do with these, if they haven't been serviced for decades, is to strip them entirely down so that you are not attempting to build on a foundation of sand. Now, that's different when you're working on a camera that has a known service history and it has actually been serviced in comparatively recent times to a good standard. And that's something that I do have to deal with from time to time, because unfortunately cameras, being mechanical devices, do break down, so it is not unknown for a camera that I'd serviced to come back, not always promptly, sometimes many years later, but it'll come back to me to deal with a particular problem. In those cases, yes, you're dealing with a particular problem. You have a particular fault, and the particular fault is likely to be the only fault that's present and can be dealt with in that fashion. But most of the cameras I deal with, that's not the case. I just dealt with a Retina 2A camera, needed its shutter dealt with. The shutter was running a bit slow, and the owner told me that he thought he'd sent it to me 6 or 7 years ago, he thought it was, and when I went through my records I discovered that actually it had been 13 years since he'd sent me the camera. And I was astonished actually. The camera was in very nice order, with the exception that the shutter needed to be serviced. It had been sitting around for that long and it needed to be serviced again. But the camera itself, it spent all of those years in a display cabinet, and honestly it was like taking a new camera out of a box. It was, everything worked very smoothly. See if I can get this leatherette off here in one piece. Some of it's being a bit stubborn. The adhesive is stuck more firmly to the aluminium body here than it has to the chrome brass trim around the edges. The Retina IIS, you don't see many of them about, they're quite thin on the ground, which is a shame. They're a particularly nice camera to use. I find them very convenient to hold. They're certainly a smaller camera than the Retina IIIS. The body casting is basically the same as that used for the Retinettes and the Retina 3C type cameras basically had the same design of casting too. The advantage of the Retinettes and indeed this Retina IIS is that you've got more room to wrap your fingers around the body of the camera than you do with a folder. Okay, so let's have a look at this. That's quite good. There's a bit of corrosion product on here, not much. That should all scrape off and that all looks relatively clean. So I'm quite pleased with the state of that. And I think that'll do now while I change this video camera battery. Okay, I better carry on with this, I suppose. Screws from the base plate. The chrome base plate here is bowed up. That's very common. It's probably the result of being thumped down on the ground too many times. It's very common for them to have a bow in them like that. You can see where it is, and that can be pushed back out without any problem at all. So don't be concerned about that. Right, let's remove that lock lever. Remove the release lever, and I want to recover the spring from that because easily lost during cleaning otherwise, or damaged. This one's not playing the game. Just wiggle that off carefully, put that to one side. The tripod socket on any of the Retinas are often loose. This one's very loose. That just slops around. That's extremely common. Part of that would be down to the fact that fasteners just tend to come loose over time, probably through things like vibration and thermal cycling, I would think. But abuse is also a good one. You probably see a mark right in the middle of that there. That's where the tip of the screw on the top head of the tripod was screwed right and hard, and basically instead of the camera drawing down tight on the head of the tripod, the screw was too long and it just drove up inside there. So in an effort to try and tighten things up, it would have been screwed harder and harder and basically stressed those three screws. And of course after that they've become loose. Right, well I need a pair of pliers to deal with that. cover that screw. Remove the sprocket shaft, and here's the guide bush from the top of the film advance. Tip out the clutch and split that open. Sprocket can be taken out. At the base of the camera, what have we got here? I'll unhook that spring from the rewind button catch. Remove the screw. And the 3 screws hold this film advance shaft in position. And they're loose. That one I can't quite find one reason or another. What's going on? There it is. I can see that that has probably a little bit more tension on there than it normally would do with one of these cameras. I'll keep that in mind. Out with our film spool. Take that bush out, put the spool to one side. This is starting to get somewhat stripped down. That's good. The Leatherettes in the front of the camera. Let's see if they'll come off nicely. Coming away from the front plate, they're not coming away from the aluminium body casting quite so well. What I'm doing here is I'm working back around the corner of the body casting here. Is anywhere the Leatherette's right on a rounded edge like that, it tends to be stuck down particularly well. That's hard to get it free. It's stuck very unevenly. Some of it is hardly held at all, and some of it's quite stubborn. Okay, there we go. It's off. So that Leatherette's in good condition. And its mate on the other side. But I'll try the same trick. I'll see if I can work in from the end here. come off without too much of a fight. Yeah, that's off too. Now, front plate's held on with 4 screws. One of them is underneath that Kodak label, so I need to get that off. Typically you want to use acetone to break up that adhesive, and I usually just poke at it with a let the acetone working around the edge and then poke at it with a toothpick to get it to come loose. When working with acetone around a camera like this, you want to be careful to see that it goes exactly where you want it to go and nowhere else, because it's very good at eating things like leatherettes or melting things like plastics. I think that's going to work. There's often a bit of flex in the label because it's not exactly dead flat, and so if you work at it and push it up and down, you'll often find that you're able to work the acetone under the edge further and further until such stage that it just pops off. You need to be patient doing this, because if you make a mess of that label, it's going to be exceptionally obvious and you're probably not going to find a spare to replace it. It's not uncommon to find cameras with a little piece of leatherette filling that space because someone made a mess of the label getting it off, or I suppose in cases where the label simply had fallen off because the adhesive had given up naturally. Well, I'll continue to work at this for 5 minutes until I can get that label to come off. Well, I've got it loose now, but I'm just going to see if I can get that to rattle completely free. It doesn't want to. So I'm just running my scalpel blade down the gap down the side of that, and I'm not trying to get my scalpel underneath it. I'm just effectively just shifted it sideways. And I'll try another drop of acetone. Avoid the temptation to dig down under one end to try and flip that up. It's quite commonly done. People use a very sharp pin or something else to do that. The mark is always exceptionally obvious afterwards. You will always see it. This one's being unusually stubborn. It may mean that something different was used to stick it down. Oh, it's definitely moving. I can move that. I'll zoom in a bit, you probably see that. So it's moving from side to side. So it's definitely loose, but it's not popping free. I'll put another drop of acetone on there. Oh, it's definitely loose. Will it lift out? Well, it'll move from side to side, but doesn't want to come free. So it means that the adhesive underneath there is rubbery. It's not a brittle adhesive. And so it's still stuck there, but the adhesive is gooey. That is weird. I'm going to try a different solvent.